When a mother looks at her children, science has shown that her brain reacts differently to each one. Marian Rojas Escapé has discovered something that will change forever how you understand family favoritism. It's not that some children are less deserving of love. It's that some children activate painful memories in their parents. Memories they just don't know how to process. Have you ever noticed that when your brother makes a mistake, it's boys will be boys? But when you make the same mistake, it's irresponsibility. Or that when you need emotional support, your parents are busy. But when other siblings need it, there's always time. If you've experienced this, I want you to know something that will free you from years of self-blame. The problem was never with you. In the next few minutes, you're going to discover the real science behind family favoritism. Why some children become invisible to their own parents, and how this apparent rejection can become your greatest strength. Marian Rojas Escapé has studied thousands of families, and what she found will transform your understanding of parental love forever. Emily's story began when she was just 6 years old. She vividly remembers the day her younger sister, Ashley, was born. Emily had eagerly anticipated meeting her new sister, but what she witnessed changed her perception of herself forever. When Ashley cried, the entire family rushed to comfort her. When Emily cried, she was told to be more mature because she was the older one. What Emily didn't know then was that she had activated something in her mother that Marian Rojas calls projection trauma. Emily's mother had been the oldest daughter in her own family and had grown up with the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings. Seeing Emily, who physically resembled her a lot as a child, awakened painful memories of a childhood where she had to mature too quickly. Marian explains that this is more common than you imagine. Parents unconsciously transfer their own unresolved traumas to the children who most resemble them, either physically or emotionally. It's not that they don't love them. It's that loving them is painful because it activates wounds that never healed. Emily became what Marian calls the mirror child. Every time her mother looked at her, she saw reflected her own lost childhood, her own unmet need to be protected and cared for. Unconsciously, her mother had decided to give Ashley everything she hadn't received. But this was at Emily's expense. The first pattern that Marian identifies is devastating. Parents tend to favor the child who is most different from them because they don't activate their personal traumas. Emily was sensitive, reflective, and observant, exactly like her mother had been as a child. Ashley was outgoing, carefree, and attention-seeking. Everything the mother would have wanted to be, but never allowed. Herself. This dynamic is not conscious. Emily's mother didn't wake up every morning, deciding to love her older daughter less, but her nervous system had associated Emily's qualities with emotional pain, while Ashley's qualities represented freedom and joy. Marian discovered something even more disturbing in her research. Families develop what she calls fixed emotional roles. Emily became the responsible one, the one who doesn't need as much, the one who always understands. Ashley became the baby, the one who needs protection, the one who needs to be taken care of. These roles become so rigid that the family maintains them even when the children grow up. At 15, Emily was still seen as the one who doesn't need as much emotional support, while Ashley, also a teenager, was still receiving all the attention when she had problems. Emily had learned not to express her needs, because every time she did, she was compared unfavorably to her sister. Ashley never causes us these problems. But here comes the first revelation that changed everything for Emily. Marian Rojas showed her that she had developed something extraordinary that Ashley never had the opportunity to develop. Having to process complex emotions from a young age, having to understand subtle family dynamics, having to be empathetic with the needs of others. Emily had developed exceptional emotional intelligence, while Ashley had grown up expecting others to solve her emotional problems. Emily had learned to navigate complex emotional landscapes, while Ashley had developed emotional dependence. Emily had developed self-confidence. It wasn't that Emily was less loved. It was that she had been trained for emotional fortitude from a very young age. Marian always says that the less favored children actually receive a terrible but powerful gift. They develop resilience, empathy, and self-understanding much earlier than their favored siblings. It's as if the universe is preparing them for a deeper and more meaningful life. The second pattern that Marian identifies is even more revealing. Parents project all their own insecurities and fears onto the less loved child. Emily realized that every criticism she received from her mother was actually a criticism her mother made of herself. When she was told she was too sensitive, it was because her mother had been criticized for the same thing as a child. This understanding was transformative for Emily. She realized that the rejection she felt had nothing to do with who she really was, but with her mother's unresolved traumas. It was as if she were receiving the punishment for crimes she hadn't committed, for wounds she hadn't caused. Marian explains that this pattern repeats in millions of families. The child who most resembles the parent in personality, sensitivity, or physical appearance frequently becomes the recipient of all the self-disapproval that parent hasn't been able to process in themselves. The third pattern is the cruelest of all. The family needs one of the children to carry all the emotional dysfunction of the system. Emily realized that she had been chosen unconsciously to be the problem, so that the rest of the family could feel normal and functional. When there were conflicts between the parents, somehow the blame ended up being on Emily for creating additional stress. When Ashley had problems in school, it was Emily's fault for not being a better example as an older sister. Emily had become what Marian calls the emotional scapegoat of the entire family. This dynamic is systematic and predictable. Marian has documented that dysfunctional families need a repository for all their emotional toxicity, and unconsciously choose the strongest, most sensitive, most capable child of processing complex emotions. Paradoxically, the least loved child is often the most emotionally intelligent in the entire family. Emily had developed the ability to read the emotions of her entire family before they even realized what they were feeling. She could predict when conflicts were coming, when her mother was sad, when her father was stressed. This ability, which should have been celebrated, became a burden because the family used it to maintain their dysfunctional equilibrium. The fourth pattern that Marian discovered is devastating. Families develop an addiction to the emotional scapegoat child. When Emily tried to set boundaries and change the dynamics, her family unconsciously sabotaged her. Dramas increased. They created artificial crises. They intensified the blame. It was as if the family system detected a threat to its toxic homeostasis and activated all its defenses. When Emily started therapy, her mother suddenly developed health problems that required constant attention. When Emily refused to mediate family conflicts, Ashley started having more frequent emotional crises. It was as if the family had a radar to detect any movement toward emotional independence from their scapegoat. Marian explains that this happens because toxic families have organized their entire emotional structure around the child who carries the problems. Without that child to project the dysfunction onto, they would have to face their own traumas, and most don't know how to do that. But here comes the second turning point that changed everything for Emily. Marian Rojas showed her that this dynamic wasn't a curse. It was a preparation. Emily had been trained, without knowing it, for a life of emotional depth, genuine empathy, and inner strength that very few people develop. The fifth pattern is perhaps the most liberating. Marian discovered that the least loved children frequently become the most successful, happy, and emotionally stable in adulthood. while their favored siblings struggle with emotional dependence, addictions, or toxic relationships. The children who grew up feeling less loved have developed the tools to create authentic and meaningful lives. Emily realized that while Ashley, at 28, still lived at her parents' house and expected others to solve her problems, she had built a successful career, healthy relationships, and a deep understanding of herself. It wasn't an accident. It was the result of years of having to develop self-confidence and emotional intelligence. Marian always emphasizes that this doesn't justify the pain these children experience, but it does explain why they frequently become the most complete and consciously aware people in their families. They've had to do the emotional work that others never had to do. The sixth pattern that Marian identifies is revolutionary. The least loved children have a unique capacity to break toxic generational patterns. Because they've experienced the pain of favoritism, they develop an acute awareness of the importance of emotional fairness. When they have their own children, they're determined not to repeat their parents' mistakes. Emily became the first person in her family line to go to therapy, to question dysfunctional patterns, to consciously work on her personal development. She realized that her role wasn't just to heal her own wounds, but to break chains of trauma that had been passed down for generations. Marian explains that the children who grow up feeling less loved frequently become healers, therapists, emotional leaders, or simply people who are committed to creating more conscious and loving relationships. Their pain drives them toward transformation. The seventh and last pattern is the most powerful. Marian discovered that when these children finally understand the dynamics and free themselves from the need for family approval, they experience an emotional freedom that very few people know. They don't need anyone's validation to know their worth, because they've learned to find it within themselves. Emily experienced this transformation at 32. After years of therapy and personal work, she finally understood that the problem had never been with her. Her family had created a system where they needed a scapegoat to function, and she had been chosen for that role. But she also realized something more powerful. She had the power to get out of that role. The liberation began when Emily implemented what Marian calls disidentification with the family function. She learned to separate her identity from her function within the family. She wasn't the problematic one, the sensitive one, or the responsible one. She was Emily, a complete person with her own needs, desires, and boundaries. The first change was subtle, but revolutionary. When her mother called to complain about Ashley, instead of absorbing the anxiety and offering solutions immediately, Emily paused and responded, "I understand that you're worried about Ashley. What's your plan to handle this situation?" She returned the responsibility to whom it really belonged. The first attempts were uncomfortable and difficult. Emily had been conditioned for decades to automatically absorb her family's emotions. Her nervous system was programmed to feel anxiety when someone else had a problem. Marian explained that this was a result of years of traumatic training, where Emily had learned that her worth depended on her ability to solve other people's problems. The deconditioning process took months. Emily had to retrain her nervous system to distinguish between her own emotions and those projected by her family. Marian taught her specific breathing and visualization techniques to create what she calls an emotional shield. When Emily felt she was absorbing other people's emotions, she breathed deeply and imagined a bubble of golden light surrounding her, returning any energy that wasn't hers. Marian also taught Emily the concept of differentiated emotional responsibility. Emily learned to ask herself, did this emotion arise in me naturally? Or am I feeling it because someone else is projecting it onto me? This simple question became a transformative tool that allowed her to reclaim her emotional autonomy. But the deepest work came when Emily began to explore her own relationship with the need for approval. Marian discovered that Emily had developed what she calls addiction to family validation. She had organized her entire life around winning the love she felt she lacked, but this kept her trapped in patterns of self-betrayal. Emily realized that she had chosen jobs, relationships, and even hobbies based on what she thought would make her parents proud, not on what she was truly passionate about. She had lived a life designed to win external approval, losing touch with her own authentic desires and needs. Marian showed Emily something revolutionary. The approval she had been desperately seeking from her family was never going to come. Not because she wasn't deserving, but because her parents didn't have the emotional capacity to give it. They had grown up without receiving that approval themselves, and they didn't know how to provide it. This revelation was initially devastating for Emily. It meant accepting that the fantasy of finally winning her parents' unconditional love was exactly that, a fantasy. But it was also liberating, because it meant that she could stop wasting her energy chasing something she was never going to receive. Marian teaches that the first step toward emotional freedom is accepting your family exactly as they are, without the need to change them, or to be changed by them. Emily had to grieve for the family she never had, in order to embrace the life she could create. The second step was developing what Marian calls conscious self-parenting. Emily learned to give herself everything she hadn't received in her childhood. Unconditional validation, celebration of achievements, comfort in difficult times, and above all, the feeling of being loved, simply for existing. Every morning, Emily implemented rituals of self-parenting. She looked in the mirror and said to herself, "Emily, I am proud of you. You are enough exactly as you are. You deserve unconditional love, starting with your own love." At first, it felt artificial, but Marian explained that it was exactly what her nervous system needed to heal decades of invalidation. Emily also started celebrating her own achievements, no matter how small. When she completed a project at work, she allowed herself to feel pride. When she made a difficult decision, she congratulated herself for her courage. When she set a boundary, she recognized herself for her strength. She was learning to be her own cheerleader, the role she had hoped her parents would fulfill. The third step was revolutionary. Emily began to set firm and consistent boundaries with her family, without extensive explanations or justifications. When her family tried to drag her into dramas that didn't concern her, she simply said, "I'm not going to participate in this," and changed the subject or withdrew from the conversation. The results were immediate and sometimes dramatic. Her family resisted strongly at first. There was guilt-tripping, emotional manipulation, attempts to return to the previous pattern. Her mother said to her, "You're not the same as before." Her father accused her of becoming selfish and insensitive. Ashley blamed her for abandoning the family when they needed her most. But Emily stood firm, and something extraordinary began to happen. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Free from the constant anxiety over the emotions of others. Free from the chronic guilt for problems she hadn't caused. Free from the desperate need to win an approval that was never going to come. Marian always emphasizes that this freedom does not mean becoming insensitive or selfish. Emily continued to love her family, but now she did it from a place of conscious choice, not desperate need. She could offer support when it was appropriate, but she no longer felt obligated to rescue everyone from their own problems. The fourth step was the most challenging. Emily had to learn to tolerate the guilt of not rescuing her family. When Ashley called her crying about her job problems, Emily had to resist the automatic impulse to rush in and solve everything. Instead, she said to her with love, I love you very much. And precisely because I love you, I'm not going to steal the opportunity to grow by solving your own problems. This was the most painful step for Emily, because she had to accept that she couldn't save her family. She had spent her whole life believing that if only she were good enough, useful enough, perfect enough, she could cure the family dysfunction. Accepting her impotence to change others was devastating, but also liberating. Marian explains that one of the most toxic patterns of the less loved children is developing what she calls the savior complex. They believe that their purpose in life is to rescue others, especially their family. But this pattern keeps them trapped in one-way relationships, where they always give but never receive. Emily had to learn the difference between loving and rescuing, between caring and enabling, between being empathetic and being codependent. Marian taught her that true love sometimes requires allowing others to face the consequences of their decisions, even when it is painful to watch. The fifth step was to build what Marian calls a chosen family. Emily began to invest her emotional energy in relationships that nurtured her. Instead of draining her, she developed deep friendships with people who saw and valued her for who she really was, not for the function she fulfilled. For the first time in her life, Emily experienced what it was like to have reciprocal relationships, where she gave and received in balance. She realized that she had normalized one-way relationships where she always gave but never received, because that was all she knew from her family. Emily met Michael, a man who had gone through a similar transformation with his own toxic family. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect, honest communication, and balanced emotional support. For the first time, Emily experienced what it was like to be loved for who she was, not for what she could offer. If this content has touched a deep wound in you, if you have recognized your own story in Emily's, YouTube has a feature called Super Thanks. It's a heart with a money symbol just below the video. When you use Super Thanks, you're not only supporting the channel, you're saying that this content has touched something real in you, that these truths need to reach more people who are suffering in silence as less loved children. It's not about the monetary value. It's about creating a network of healing for wounded hearts who need to know that they're not alone in this struggle. The sixth step was perhaps the most transformative. Emily learned to rewrite the narrative of her life. Instead of seeing herself as the rejected daughter, she began to see herself as the family pioneer. Instead of the one who was never enough, she saw herself as the one who had the courage to break toxic patterns. Instead of the troublemaker, she recognized herself as the one who dared to seek the truth. Marian stresses that this shift in narrative isn't about denial or superficial positive thinking. It's a therapeutic recontextualization based on real facts. Emily really was a pioneer. She really did have courage. She really did seek the truth. She just misinterpreted these qualities as flaws. Emily realized that her sensitivity, which had been constantly criticized by her family, was actually her superpower. It allowed her to detect dishonesty, navigate complex emotional situations, and connect deeply with others. Her analytical ability, which had been seen as overthinking, was actually exceptional emotional intelligence. Her tendency to question family dynamics, which had been labeled as rebellion or disrespect, was actually a moral compass guiding her towards more authentic and healthy relationships. Her need for justice, which had been seen as problematic, was actually a quality that would make her a leader and advocate for others. The seventh and final step was the most liberating. Emily learned to live from her complete authenticity, without modifying her personality to gain approval. She stopped apologizing for being sensitive, intelligent, questioning, or different. She realized that these qualities weren't bugs in her system. They were features. Today, Emily maintains contact with her family, but from a completely different place. Not from need or obligation, but from conscious choice. She has established clear boundaries about what conversations she will have and, which she won't, what responsibilities she will assume and which are not hers. Her relationship with Ashley has improved dramatically. Paradoxically, when Emily stopped trying to rescue her sister, Ashley began to respect her more. When Emily stopped being available 24/7 for emotional crises, Ashley had to develop her own emotional management tools. Her parents have begun to treat her with more respect, although they have never explicitly acknowledged the patterns of the past. Marian explains that this is common. Families rarely admit their toxic dynamics, but they do respond to change when one of the members genuinely transforms. The most beautiful thing of all is that Emily finally feels at home with herself. She no longer needs to seek that sense of belonging in others, because she has found it within herself. She has created a life that reflects her authentic values, surrounded by people who love her for who she really is. Marian always says that this is the true freedom, not needing your family's approval to be happy, but also not needing to reject them completely. It's loving from fullness instead of lack, from strength instead of desperation. Now I want to share with you the exact protocol that Marian created specifically for children who feel less loved. It's simple, but transformative. For 30 days, every time you feel like you're seeking family approval, you're going to pause mentally and ask yourself, am I acting from my authenticity, or am I performing to gain love? If you're performing, return to your authenticity. Emily practiced this religiously. When she found herself changing her opinion to avoid family conflicts, she paused and expressed her truth with love, but firmness. When she discovered herself minimizing her achievements so as not to overshadow Ashley, she stopped and celebrated her successes completely. The second exercise is to create what Marian calls a self-validation ritual. Every night before sleeping, Emily asked herself, "What am I proud of today?" and recognized herself for at least 3 things, however small they were. She was retraining her brain to seek validation internally rather than externally. The third exercise is about setting conscious boundaries. Emily made a list of the family dynamics she was no longer willing to tolerate, mediating conflicts between her parents, rescuing Ashley from her self-imposed problems, apologizing for problems she hadn't caused. Every time the family tried to activate these patterns, Emily responded from her new programming. Marian discovered in her research that less loved children frequently develop extraordinary relationships when they learn to love themselves first. Emily became an incredible friend, a loving partner, and eventually a conscious mother who broke the generational patterns in her own family. When Emily had her daughter, Sophia, she consciously committed to loving her unconditionally. It didn't matter if Sophia was sensitive like her or extroverted like Ashley. Emily made sure that her daughter knew that she was loved simply for existing. She broke the chain of family favoritism that had existed in her family for generations. If you've made it this far, I want you to know something. Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward your own liberation. You're not crazy. You're not exaggerating. And it's definitely not your fault. Your experience is valid. Your pain is real. And you deserve to heal. Remember what I told you at the beginning. When a mother looks at her children, her brain reacts differently to each one. But that reaction says more about the parent's unresolved traumas than about the inherent worth of the children. Emily found her freedom when she understood this. And you can find yours too. Marian Rojas always says, "You are not responsible for the love you didn't receive, but you are responsible for the love you give yourself." And that's exactly what Emily learned, and what you can learn too. At what point did you realize you were the less loved child? what pattern I talked about resonated most deeply with you. Share your story in the comments, because your experience might be exactly what another person needs to read to begin their own healing process. I read all the comments and want to know how this content touched your heart.